Thank you, George and friends. My name is Andrew Richardson. I'm the SVP of Analytics and Marketing Sciences here at Tenuity. Thanks so much for spending some time with myself and Liz. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me with the mic? I'm pretty loud in general, but I am Liz Emery. I am the VP of Mobile and Ad Tech at Tenuity, focusing on all things privacy and future of the web for mobile and beyond.
Awesome. So thanks again for spending time with us. Liz and I are going to, just riff a little bit on some different topics around privacy, around measurement, and some of the changes that we've been seeing and some of the things that we know are going to continue over the next 5+ years, and hopefully getting y'all maybe a little bit better prepared and talking about things in certain ways. And if we've got some time at the end, we actually do want to open it up. We've got an intimate group here, which I'm excited about. So if there's any topics that we didn't cover off on that you're really interested in, we want to make sure that we talk about those. So Liz, I'm going to start with a question to you. So we've talked about this, and just so you know, Liz and I, the cool thing for us is this is like a normal day. We literally get together and get to talk about these things all the time. And so I want to start with a question to you around, I think that for a lot of marketers, especially if they haven't been in this space specifically, or if they've only been in digital, the things that have happened around privacy and the future of the web and the things that are yet to come with cookies and all of those things, it can be a little bit daunting. But we've been here before, right? Talk a little bit about that and just like maybe put some people at ease as we get into some more difficult topics here in a second.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions, and I get it all the time. But I think every time there's a change to privacy, whether that's, can spam or that's, TCPA, everyone has this freak out moment. And we go through like the 5 stages of grief, right? Where we're like, I'm in denial that I can no longer use this. And then we get all the way to acceptance in our new normal. And so the biggest thing that I tell people when I talk to them when we think about cookies going away is that we've been here before, right? We've experienced this before. Surprisingly enough, marketing hasn't gone anywhere. Marketing's not dead. We just adapt, right? And I think that's like the biggest thing is that it all comes down to shifting your strategy, shifting how you think about things. And big ones that we'll talk about that you guys will already be hearing about anytime you pick up the newspaper is first-party data. Invest in first-party data. Diversify how you use it. Modeled conversions, which is my favorite one, right? Like diversifying how you do measurement in general. And I'm going to turn it on you, Andrew. That's something popped into my head, so I have to fire it your way. So I get a lot of concerns about the shift to a modeled world, right? A shift to modeling in general. I can't see things on a one-to-one basis. How do I work with modeled conversions? How do I use my first-party data? So I'm going to fire this at you. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the world of moving towards modeling? And then number 2, don't tell me just to give all of my first-party data to partners, right? Because that's something I'll be like, oh, give your data to partners. Give it to us. We'll use it to power things. There's a lot of fear there. So I would love to turn that on you and what you think about those 2 things right now.
Yeah, so I would say a couple of thoughts come to mind. So number 1, I think that on the first-party data side, we have some great partners that we work with, right? Whether that's Google or Meta or TikTok or other partners that I think for different marketers, there is a different level of comfort in passing data to those partners. And that's okay, right? But I think that there's information that everybody needs to understand around this modeled world. And I'm going to come back to the first party data point. First of all, a lot of conversions for a really long time have already been modeled, right? And I think that's an area that folks don't necessarily think about or recognize. They're saying, well, cookies are going away and cookies have already started going away. And so we've got a lot of data that now is going to be modeled data. It's already been happening, right? It's not like we're going to flip a switch and all of a sudden cookies go away and now what are we going to do with that? We've been in this world and it happens. And even if those conversions haven't been modeled because there's been a forcing factor of cookies going away, they still have been modeled, right? I don't remember the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but something like 40% of all consumers clear their cache at least monthly. So if you're someone who has a longer cycle from a sales perspective than 30 days, the odds are a lot of your data is already modeled anyways, because you're not going to have that one-to-one connection that you maybe had been used to previously. So I think that we need to all be comfortable with that and understand that it's been happening. This is not a brand new thing. How it happens, the level that it happens is a little bit different depending on what we're talking about, and that's okay. But I think taking that back to the first party data component, and that side of it is, you don't have to share everything with these partners, right? And as we talk to partners, whether it's a Google or a Meta or others, they don't necessarily want or need all of the same data that you have in order to make the models that they're building better, tighter, stronger. So I think there's that component. A lot of the data that we've dealt with for years has just been hashed email addresses. That's still significantly better than nothing, right? From that standpoint, number one. And number two, the more data that we give into these algorithms, the tighter those algorithms become and the more they are able to produce for you. So I think that there are ways to test into that, right? I wouldn't just whole hog, just say I'm going to completely overhaul my first party data strategy, what I ask from consumers, what I give to partners, what I do myself. You've got to really move your way into this from more of a crawl, walk, run approach. It was easier to say than actually to do, I think. But I think that there are ways to do that. And as we work with our brands and as we work with our partners, that's an area that I would say that we try to focus on, right? You and I have these conversations of like, well, you're not collecting a whole lot of first party data. You might be getting email addresses. What if you asked for a little bit more in some sort of a value exchange with your consumer, right? And so I think that there's ways for us to not have to just give everything over and let the computers and the machines decide, and to also have comfort in the fact that we've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, well, I think you nailed something that I really want to reiterate for everyone here is that you don't have to give all of your data to make things work for you, right? And I think that's a big misconception as we move towards this world where I'm going to say first-party data has always been important, right? But while there's now a spotlight on it, it's not saying give everything you know about your consumers, your users, your buyers to each platform, but being selective and using it, it makes a big difference. Like we see it as we work across a variety of verticals, mobile, not mobile. We do see the impact when you use your data strategically versus being in denial about the world that we're in right now, which kind of tees me up to something else I want to chat about is I have a mobile background, so I've experienced a lot of privacy changes already, right? From different changes on iOS with the IDFA to GAID to all these different things. And I cope, and Andrew knows this, I'm an emotional eater, so that's how I've coped through this. But, you know, over the last 2 years, we've already experienced these change. Yep. Whereas now we're really working towards this cookieless world, right? And we're already partially there, and we've been partially there. So here is my question to you as somebody who's lived it to a large degree. What do you think the impact is as an industry if we don't get things right, you know, when it comes to a cookieless world? As we walk towards this and, like, you know, we see the whole range, right? We see some people who are super proactive and they're thinking about it and they're thinking about changes. And then we see other people who are like, I'm in denial. I'm not going to address this until it's right in my face. So, like, what do you think the impact is on the industry if we don't, like, start responding or really start thinking about it?
I think that it's an interesting question, and I say it's interesting from the standpoint of I think that the industry has gotten it wrong by and large from this standpoint. I think that we've all thought to a certain extent that the sky is falling, and then we've refuted some of that with like, we've been here before, right? But I think that the way that I think about this, and the way that I'm saying that we've gotten it wrong is these are opportunities for brands, in my opinion, right? We push the brands, a lot of the brands that we work with, into collecting more first-party data, yes, but just using the data that you have already today to understand what that impact could be while we're moving more into this world, right? And so when I say the industry has gotten it wrong, what I mean is for years we've been so reliant on trying to get this one-to-one connection in every single possible way that we can. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think that what we've done is we've allowed ourselves to become, I'm going to use the word lazy to a certain extent, right? And I guess I could be a little more kind and say we've gotten accustomed to not having to use as much of the data that we have as efficiently as we could. And we're not talking about going from 0 to 100. I talk about the crawl and the walk and the run, But just being able to say, we have data and we use it because we do, let's say, email. Well, your email campaigns, there's a couple of brands that we work with that every customer gets the same email. It doesn't matter if you bought something 6 months ago or last week, everybody's getting the same emails. There's an opportunity there that exists. And if you're saying, well, I know our competitors are doing that same thing, and so we're kind of following along with how the vertical in which we operate, is doing things, that's okay, but you could also differentiate yourselves and not doing it in a way that says, let me go spend $500,000 to put together these models that's going to do this and this and this. Just something as simple as, and you all have experienced this, so I'm going to stick on the email point for a second. Understanding if the audience that you're talking to is male or female or non-binary, right? And as you send emails, just being like, I have now a men's shoe or a women's top or something that's gender neutral. Those are massive differences that don't take very much lift, but we as marketers have forgotten that we could just go look at the data that we have to do that. And so.
Well, I think just to add on there, one of the biggest things that I tell to people is like taking a step back and remember, like as marketers, we're in it, right? Like we're thinking about like how do we do things efficiently? How do we do things cheaply? How do we do these things? But if you remember, people aren't going to your site to experience that site, right? They're going to experiencing your brand holistically. So using your data to make your experiences connect, right? Using your data to personalize, like to make sure that someone actually gets to that point of sale or gets to the point where they become, as an app person, a loyalist, right? They get to those further points, makes a huge difference. And sometimes, and I'm guilty of it too, we get so into the day-to-day that we're like, okay, this is what's easy, this is what I've done. But I look at everything that's happening, and if you guys can throw tomatoes at me if you want, but I look at all this stuff as a positive to how we as marketers now have to think about strategy, right? Like how we have to approach things, how we have to think about audience versus like, well, I'll just, the algorithm will figure it out. Like I'll find the right audience, like we're challenged again. And that's not a bad thing, right?
I have a question. So talk about challenges. You obviously have lived in the mobile world more than maybe some folks who are in the room. Trying to think of the right way to ask this question. We know that one of the forcing factors at play here and how we think about measurement, obviously, as a part of this, are a lot of the changes that have come, and I think positive changes because I'm for consumer privacy like through and through as a consumer as well as a marketer. If everybody tomorrow, if the only options were for people to buy an iPhone or an Apple computer, would marketing just cease to exist because we now can't track the way that we can in other avenues?
So I love this question. No, right? Like the reality is if you take a step back and like you look at Apple, you look at Google, it's not like they're making these changes because they're anti-advertising, right? They're not sitting there and being like, ha ha ha, I'm going to screw up every brand out there, right? You like that evil? I felt like Mr. Burns. But
right.
What they're doing is essentially responding to what people are saying, right? The last stat at Tenuity, we did like a survey, and it was like 78% of people believe there's no such thing as online privacy, right? So of course, Apple and Google and legislation and government, they're gonna respond to these things by making these changes. And the honest thing is like we're already kind of in a world like that functions like that, right? Like if you look at it, I think it was like, 50% of devices are already using like Apple's ecosystem, right? So tracking there is limited. I think 25% of people are using some kind of ad blocker. 31% are using some kind of VPN. So essentially, we're already kind of in that world. We're just living in denial because we can still see some sort of number, right? So like, we're at this point now where we are, to Andrew's point earlier, we're already dependent on modeling more than we realize, right? And we're just kind of being like really comfortable being like, I can still see 20% of one-to-one conversions or 20% trackable. So we're just like, okay, cool, this is great. I'm just not going to address it. So advertising's not going anywhere, but again, it's how you approach it that is. And that's kind of, you teed up my question for you that I wrote down. This is how I write down questions before, guys. But so now, like, how do we do this, right? If you're like, take yourself out of like the agency world, you're a brand now, you're representing something. How should we function in this world without tracking to the degree that we've been tracking? How should we think about measurement when we're not on a one-to-one? Because, obviously we have a bunch of different verticals in here, a bunch of different people who are sitting here being like, okay, great, you've told me I can't track to the same way. What do I do now?
Yeah, so I'm gonna take myself back actually to one of the first Tenuity Live, was the very first like Tenuity Live. It wasn't called that back then, 5 years ago, when I started here. I gave a presentation that was basically how incrementality is better than attribution. And I think at that time, 5 years ago, some feedback that I got afterwards was kind of like, well, like I understand that like what you're saying, but I still have this attribution model over here that's still able to tell me all these things. We are now back, and it's just funny how like I could probably recycle that entire presentation for this event, and everyone would be like, "That's amazing! You're like genius!" And it's the same stuff, right? But if you're sitting in this room today and you don't know if the marketing that you do provides incrementally more revenue than if you did no marketing, you have to start there, period. Like I will full stop and answer any other questions that someone may have about this afterwards. Or what, if you do not know definitively that the dollars you are spending give you more revenue than if you didn't spend those dollars, and I'm not talking about looking at what Meta tells me or what Google tells me when there are things that are modeled. I'm talking about being able to track this more down to individual user level and tying it back to whether it be geography or tests that you run. You have to be able to answer that question, right? So if I'm at a brand, that's one thing that I'm looking at immediately is understanding, is this doing more than if I didn't, right? And I don't do that by turning off my media. I do it in more sophisticated ways if I've got the ability to do that. That's one. The second thing is, I want to make sure that now that I know, and I can do these in parallel, that my marketing dollars actually do provide more than if I didn't spend that. How do I know that I'm spending in the right places? Well, what we've done in the past is we've said, well, I'm going to spend over here because that's kind of what I spent last year, and that platform worked pretty well for me. So if I put a little bit more there, maybe it'll go a little bit further for me. This platform, I tested into it last year, and it worked well from a testing perspective. Maybe I'll put a little bit more budget there. This one's not performing as well, so I'm going to pull those dollars out. Well, where are you looking at that data from, right? Are you looking at it holistically across all of your channels? Are you trusting just the platform measurement? There's very different ways that we need to look at that, but where I'm going with that is I need to do some marketing mix modeling, right, to understand if I'm spending dollars in the right place. Because some places we come into brands, honestly, and Liz knows this, like especially in the mobile world, where they're like, I've just been advertising here because it seems to be working. Well, how can you tell that it's working? Well, when I reduced my spend, I saw less of the thing that I wanted. Well, but there was also this, COVID was happening at the same time. And like this influencer said or didn't say this, there's a lot of impact that comes into play there. So I would really say incrementality, and then let's get into some marketing mix modeling. And I'm also saying if you've got attribution, you don't have to throw it out. Right, and for us at Tenuity, we talk about that, and we call it unified measurement. Right, that's I think an area where we can't just say platforms are the thing. We're going to trust it. We've always trusted it, but I've got to look at a couple of different avenues to triangulate what's happening now with my business. That's what I would do if I were a brand today and a marketer, and I wasn't working on the agency side. That's where I would lean in.
Well, and I think the takeaway too that I want to add here is that one of the big fears that we hear about a lot is that this is going to be extremely expensive. Right? Like this is what I've gone off of. I don't want to spend so much money on all these different models. You don't have to, right? Like you don't have to be like, all right, I'm going to buy an incrementality testing, this, that, and the other thing. You can phase it out for what makes sense to your business, for what you're seeing in your data based on the channels you're running, right? And that's conversations that Andrew and I have across the board is like, what makes sense for you now? What do we want to see while we still have some kind of signals coming in versus fast forward when we don't have cookies, right? And if your model is completely based on that. So it's a good opportunity at this moment to start rotating out in things, right? To start seeing things, to start testing things, because to a degree you can compare it to the signals that you can see. So like I always like to kind of like, put out the fire of that fear of like, it's going to be so expensive. Oh my gosh, I'm not paying for this, right? So like dip your toe in, see what makes sense, and figure it out for your vertical and your brand.
Yeah. George has a question. We're actually getting ready to wrap up, so this is perfect.
I'm on board with Tenuity, so I'm setting up one. I think it's in the CMO white paper that is there being distributed now. I actually made that point. I was a CMO by chance. I sold an agency to a big professional services firm. And even though we're a data firm, Murky, we didn't have a lot of this stuff in place. And I just made it my business to be fixated on what everything cost and to remember it and to write it down. so I embarrassed myself at a conference amongst my peers and saying, yeah, I generated an SQL of $2,200. And one of my ex-clients, I'm from the agency side from IBM, came up and said, George, I think you meant $220. I said, no, 2,200. He goes, please don't say that again, you're really embarrassing yourself. And so I made it my objective to learn as much as I could just by understanding each channel. And I sit on a B2B CMO roundtable now. There are 50 CMOs on the roundtable. And the majority of the CMOs don't understand the cost of an individual response, which blows my mind because the point you were making is so critically important to where we are today. Marketing doesn't stop. Your competitors are still going to be spending the same or more money than they were spending before. You're still going to be advertising and having a database, first-party data. But we as CMOs have really missed the mark, I think, and over-relied. I'm definitely, as you know, for all the technology, etc., but unless you know the cost of an individual response, unless you know that when I turn on the brand advertising, retail sales increase. Why? Oh, that's why we did advertising in the first place. It's sort of mind-blowing. I've got a question for you, though.
I'm ready for it. I forgot I had this in my hand.
I heard 2022 is going to be the year of mobile.
You want to repeat that question just so that...
That was just the most devastating. No. I get, this is like a pet peeve of mine that he's just throwing right in my face. Like, everything's mobile, right? If you think about yourself as a user and an individual, where do you consume the most, right? Like myself, if I'm on my laptop, I'm working. Besides that, I'm either, on my phone or I'm doing streaming things, right? So that's why I always say, you got to look at things omni-channel, guys, because mobile is 80% of time spent for the average user. Yep. It's a crazy world. So I got the 3 minutes left.
Yeah. One point that, and Liz, I want to make sure that you covered off on this around you don't have to break the bank. George, I want to piggyback on something that you were talking about a little bit, just on the value of bringing people in. I think the other thing that folks don't look at when we talk about measurement, and it ties back to how much do you have to spend on this, is how do you measure measurement, right? How do you go in and say, well, I don't want to spend, if I really do need to do a marketing mix model and I know it's going to cost me $250,000, how do I know that I got value out of that $250,000? And how do I project that? I think that is a critical component that if you're going back to your brands, you have to be able to have that conversation, right? We'll go in and as we talk to brands and say, listen, we think there are better ways to spend your dollars. We'd like to spend some time here digging into this. Whether we do your marketing mix model or you go with someone else, we think that we can drive X% more revenue or efficiency or leads or whatever the case may be, and measure yourself against that, right? I'm not saying you go out and say, I do this modeling or I do this incrementality testing and all of a sudden I see 30% more X. You're not going to necessarily see that. But for a lot of brands, just refining what they do to use their own data today and making sure they measure measurement, right, and put the people behind it and the process behind it to do that. We've seen a lot of brands that we work with that when they've adopted that, all of a sudden they're off like a rocket ship because now there are no further questions when you go back to the CFO about whether or not it's working, right? If you get the CFO in your corner, now all of a sudden it becomes easier. And the next $500,000 that you say you want to go spend in marketing, they know that it's incremental dollars and they know you're going to show them the value of that $500,000 you just asked for. No one can beat that, right? Instead of just kind of blindly going and asking for those. So. And
I think one takeaway, because we're getting close on time, that I kind of want to leave you guys with perfect timing, is that right now you're going to be met with a lot of different partners and vendors that have solutions to signal loss, right? And a lot of those solutions are built off of vaguer definitions of what fingerprinting means, right? Or a vague definition of, how this rule is going to work. As you guys are thinking about solutions, as these cross your desk, definitely vet them. Ask those questions. So if fingerprinting does go away, what does that mean for this solution? Without cookies, how is this going to be powered? Because part of my role at Tenuity working in the ad tech side is exactly that, right? We call a BS detector. They send me into a meeting to figure out if that's actually going to be sustainable long term, or is that sustainable for 6 months, 7 months, etc.? So that's something to think about too, and like, make sure, ask the hard questions. Don't let them razzle dazzle you with the marketing presentation. I know I like, transitions and slides too, but make sure that, you're kind of asking those questions, because you're going to see those coming up a lot more right now.
We have just a couple of minutes left. If there's we'll ask one. If there's one more question that anybody has that we didn't cover off on, we're happy to answer that before we bounce out of the room. Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about spend.
Mm-hmm.
How do you measure pricing?
Spend versus pricing and measuring. Yeah, so I think it depends a little bit on where you sit, right? And like, I know that Phil and Nancy, who are up here, were talking a lot about Amazon in the last session before us. There's a lot of ways that we will go and analyze spend and work with our brands around, maybe it's a product launch, maybe it's a
Products stay the same price, and so like airline tickets now, prices are becoming dynamic.
Sure. So your question is around analyzing the impact of marketing relative to that, or like elaborate there. Sorry.
What I meant is that are you also able to measure the incrementality of lowering your price by 50 cents?
Oh, absolutely.
Increasing it at a certain time?
Yeah, great question. So it was around like lowering or increasing your pricing and measuring the incremental value or decrease in value of that. Yeah, when we talk about incrementality, and you can plug this word into however you need to, we'll measure incrementality that's margin based oftentimes, not just incrementality of revenue, right? Because if denim works better for you than shoes, why would you not want to know that as a marketer? And if I've got a person in front of me who is looking, I want to push them to denim if it makes sense. Otherwise, then I want to push them to shoes because that's what they're also looking at. Measuring that incrementally is hugely important. Measuring and understanding that relative to what your consumers have purchased in the past to increase the incremental value of the initial marketing dollars. So looking and saying, in the category where everyone buys denim, 60% of those consumers come back and buy shoes. That's huge for me to understand. Do you know that or not? And then measuring that. Maybe you can offer a discount on shoes to someone who comes in because the incremental value of buying denim is really high for you. So looking at margins and looking at profit at different SKUs even, not even just different categories, and measuring the incrementality of that is definitely doable and something we do. So thank you all very much. Liz and I are around if you have any other questions. Appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of the day.